Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for joining us in person and online. I'll try to talk to the camera as well. We have a huge number of people joining online. Today, we're delighted to host Zeinab Badawi and to hear about her first and new book, An African History of Africa, From the Dawn of Humanity to Independence. Many thanks, Zeinab, for joining us. We at the Wheel Institute and London Business School, as soon as we heard about the new book, we're very excited and we thought we can't miss the opportunity to have you. So very happy that you're here with us this evening. And just sharing some brief introductions. Zeinab is an award-winning broadcaster, journalist, filmmaker. She's the president at SOAS, University of London, since 2021. She's one of the best-known broadcast journalists working in the field today. Her work includes interviewing some of the world's most notable personalities and politicians. She's also the founder of the production company Kush Communications, which creates thought-provoking programs and films, including the groundbreaking 20-part documentary series, An History of Africa with Zeinab Badawi, which informed and inspired so many of us about the history of a continent throughout the years. Zeinab studied philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford University and took a master's degree in Middle East history and anthropology at SOAS London University. Zeinab had also previously chaired the Royal Africa Society, with whom the Wheel Institute collaborates every year. We organize a business lecture here in this same very room. To join in conversation with Zeinab, we have Elias Papayannou, my colleague, professor of economics at London Business School, co-academic director of the Wheel Institute for Business and Development. Amongst many other topics and achievements, Elias has 20 years of work and research in Africa and has been recognized in top academic publications, being the last one, a publication in Nature. Elias also led the Wheel Institute award-winning course called The History of Africa Through the Lenses of Economics. And I hope some of you are here because he joined the course a couple of years ago. It was a remarkable open access initiative that attracted almost 30,000 people across the world and dozens of academics internationally and locally. The Wheel Institute for Business and Development, which I represent here tonight, is a research institute at London Business School, with particular focus on the role of business as a force for development in the world. Our funders are actually here tonight, Tony and Maureen Wheeler. Thank you for joining us. Tony is an LBS alum, and you may know them as they are the founders of Lonely Planet, a company that opened the world for us and allow us to know more about our planet in a very unique way. Last time I spoke with Tony, this has been 4 months ago. I think you have been to 157 countries, probably more now. I think just came back from a trip to Africa. And I also know that Zeinab has been to 34 countries in Africa. So I think, it would be good to know who is ahead of the game on the regional level. I'm sure you can chat about that tonight. An African History of Africa. So that's the name of this book. And just for the title, it's a much needed book. It's also fascinating and never explored journey through the continent. So the book has already hit the #1 spot in Sunday Times bestsellers for hardcover non-fiction books. Don't forget to buy a copy. There is a stand outside. That's also why you're here tonight. So be very welcome to join the stand outside. Zeinab very kindly will be signing some copies. And it's the book that brought us here too. Finally, just a couple of housekeeping rules. You have 2 exits on the top, 2 exits on the bottom. For those that are online, please submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. Zeinab will start with a brief introduction, then Elias and Zeinab will be in conversation, and there will be 20-25 minutes for Q&A from the audience here and online from the Zoomies. Zeinab, the floor is yours. Our many thanks for joining us tonight, and we look forward to the talk and conversation. Many thanks to all of you for joining us as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Tiago and Elias, and lovely to have you with us, the Wheelers. And hello and good evening to everybody here. It's my great pleasure. I'm very privileged that this has been arranged for me today. So I just want to really say a few words about the genesis of this project. And Tiago has already alluded to the fact that I made a 20-part TV series on the history of Africa, starting from the origins of humankind to the modern era. And really, the title of the book should be, It Doesn't Matter If You're Late, We're Cool About It, or something like that, because everybody I interviewed in this, who I cite as my sources in this book, I would always arrive late, because sometimes in certain African cities the traffic would be really bad and I'd arrive late, and you know, the academics, the historians, the anthropologists, the archaeologists would all say, it doesn't matter really, you know, and I would often have to tear myself away from them at the end of my interaction with them. And these were great scholars I met, you know, dozens and dozens of them. And I kept on thinking to myself, you know what, in the TV series, I haven't really done justice to them, because so much of what they told me in these interviews about a particular aspect of African history would just hit the cutting room floor. And that's why this idea was kind of germinating, you know, that I really should try and ventilate their amazing scholarship. So that's really what gave rise to the book. And I really have three objectives in writing it. I wanted to counter the idea that Africa has no history, because that is an idea that's proved to be remarkably persistent, that, you know, a lot of scholars, Europeans particularly, say, look, Africa didn't really write until the arrival of the Europeans, and we recorded what was going on, the missionaries, the explorers, the colonial officers. And the fact is, Africa did write, but perhaps sources that the European scholars didn't always want to look at. The Arabic, a lot of Africans wrote in Arabic from a very, very early stage, because Islam obviously came very early to the continent. There were other languages there. The Ethiopians have had their own language since about the 2nd century, I want to say. 2nd century, yes, the 2nd or 3rd century. So, you know, Africa did write, but even if Africa did not write, it does not mean it did not record its history. You have to just get at it in different ways, through oral tradition, musicology, and that kind of thing. So this is what African scholars do. They have a much broader range of sources than a lot of the Western scholarship, and that's why I think their perspective is very, very important, because it brings a different kind of lens to African history. So that's one of the first objectives I wanted to do. I wanted to counter this idea that Africa has no history, or what it does have has been somewhat denigrated or written by outsiders. And then I wanted to really put these African scholars center stage insofar as I could. I thought, look, I have something of an international profile. Let me try and name these marvelous men and women and just give them a bit of a public platform, so that we can accord them the respect of telling their own history to a much wider audience. And then my third objective was really, I wanted the reader, and a general reader, it's not an academic book, I hope it's quite accessible in the way it's written. I wanted the reader to perhaps be stimulated in wanting to find out more about the aspects of the history that I had covered, so that they would be excited and want to go and find out more about the work of these scholars, or the particular aspect of African history that may have excited them. So those are my three objectives. I also tried to cover the continent as best I could: North, South, East, West, Central Africa. So I believe I have highlighted each region at a particular period in history. People will admonish me and say, but you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But of course, you know, in one book I couldn't do everything, but I'm quite satisfied that I have at least given justice to all the regions as even-handedly as I could. And remember, you know, I had one Southwest African country ambassador come up and say, you didn't mention my country at all. And I'm like, you know what, actually I go so far back, and countries in Africa were not really, for the most part, formed until the end of the 19th century. So I'm looking at regions. It's really only in the very final chapter, penultimate chapter rather, that I look at, you know, resistance and liberation, where you can talk meaningfully of countries. I wanted deliberately to focus on Africa's pre-colonial past, because I think there's been a lot of emphasis on Africa's history once the Europeans arrived, and also on post-independence Africa and, you know, the current period. So I really wanted to do the history that was occluded. I mean, if you say to most people, name me an African king or queen, most people would be stumped, wouldn't they? They would probably say, I don't know, Tutankhamun, and then they'd say, well, was he really African? People might say Shaka Zulu, perhaps, and have an idea of him from a Hollywood movie or whatever. So it's this ignorance, really, that I think I found to be the most striking aspect of this project, not only outside the continent, but even in the continent of Africa itself. You know, I was wandering around Unilag, the University of Lagos, and talking to Nigeria's brightest and the best, and said to them, what do you know about, you know, your history? And they said, well, there's the slave coast that goes around, you know, Nigeria on the Atlantic. We were formed in 1914, and that was about it in terms of their history. Of course, they knew contemporary stuff much better, and that wasn't atypical, really. Even my own mother, an educated woman, when I said to her, look, Mum, what do you know about the pyramids of ancient Sudan? Because we have 1,000 pyramids in northern Sudan, where I was born. And about 250 to 300 of them preserve their superstructure. I mean, not many people know that there are 1,000 pyramids in Sudan, 100 in Egypt. The Sudanese ones are much smaller, and they buried the dead in tombs adjacent to the pyramid, not inside like the ancient Egyptians, until they relocated their burial site to the Valley of the Kings in Luxor. And my mother said, well, we went to see them once upon a time, ages ago, you know, on a school trip, but she couldn't give me any dates. She couldn't give me the names of any of the kings and the queens. And one former African president, Obasanjo, former president of Nigeria, said to me, you know what, Zeinab, I can give you the names of English medieval kings and the orders so much better than I can Africans. And so this really was a huge impetus for me. I wanted to really, you know, combat this ignorance, and I learnt a great deal myself in the process. So that's the genesis of the project. Although, actually, I should just say, before I hand over to Elias, it goes back even further, because the TV series grew out of a conversation I had when I went to the headquarters of UNESCO in Paris. And I was sitting in the office of my friend Getachew Ngida, an Ethiopian who was then Deputy Director General of UNESCO. And as I was sipping my tea, I said to him, what are those volumes in your bookcase behind you? And he said, oh, they're the General History of Africa volumes. And I said, what are those? And he said to me, well, it's Africa's history from the beginning of time to the modern era, written by Africans for the most part. And I said, tell me more. And he said, well, the General History of Africa was a project that was conceived in the early 1960s by the newly independent presidents of Africa. They said, look, we've decolonized our countries, we want to decolonize our history, so they appealed to UNESCO to facilitate this project for them. So the Director General, a Frenchman at the time, René Maillot, said, OK, I'll do that for you. And they set up a committee, and they scoured the continent of Africa for the best archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, paleontologists, you name it. And they compiled volume after volume after volume of Africa's history from an African perspective, using, you know, oral tradition, as I said, musicology and, you know, archaeology, to build a picture to counter the Western narrative. And these volumes are marvelous. And as I say in my book, they're very much, you know, my guiding star, my inspiration. But they're not accessible. For a start, they're 9 volumes. They've got so many hands going through them. They've been edited by people galore. And they're written in a fairly turgid style, so they're not accessible. But the idea behind them is what really inspired me to make the TV series. And all the academics I cited, I would always discuss with UNESCO's committee and the chairman to say, you know, this is who I'm going to be talking to in Congo or Angola or whatever. And they'd say, yep, that person's great. That person's contributed to the general history of Africa, which is why I feel that, you know, this underpins the validity of the opinions which are expressed in this book that it has the UNESCO imprimatur. So that's the genesis of the TV series, and then the TV series was the sort of genesis of the book. So here I am.
So thank you, Zeinab, for taking the time and being with us. So I have some questions for Zeinab. Let me just say, having read half of the book during the Greek Orthodox Easter, that it is a fantastic read, not only because it gives the African perspective and thinks of the continent as a unified kind of theory, but it is also very well researched. So, for example, the last chapters that you provided, like while you were writing the book on the scramble for Africa, the slave trades, colonization, are very thoroughly researched. And I want to echo what you said in your introductory remarks, that you have the references if you are interested in one particular area, let's say the Kingdom of Ghana, which was not in contemporary Ghana, by the way. There are always the references in the very end, and for those who are more keen in exploring and learning more, you can do that. And my second remark, which actually touches a bit on the work both at the Wheeler Institute and my own journey in research, when I started doing research on African economic history, we were like 3 or 4. Leonard Wansecon, currently at Princeton from Benin, Stelios Michalopoulos at Brown, Nathan Nunn at the time at Harvard. And at the time, most people will tell us, this is not mainstream economics. Why on earth are you doing economic history? It was not an important topic, at least in the early 2000s. Why Africa? You should work on the Industrial Revolution. You should work on, perhaps Europe or the US. And what we have seen is that more and more people nowadays in my profession, in economics, want to learn more about history, want to learn more about Africa and learn about development. And there has been a spread of research looking nowadays on development economics. And I think nowadays we see more interest to connect development economics with a knowledge of history and political economy. And at the Wheeler Institute, we have been promoting not only research, but also innovative teaching, like the one that Tiago mentioned and many others, going even in with Rajesh to townships in Johannesburg, trying to blend history. And South Africa, as you document in the book, has a fantastic and truly amazing kind of history, and try to see how this history matters today in the lives of micro-entrepreneurs. So I strongly urge you to really look at this book. It comes, I think, at a very good time. I think the population of Africa will reach, by 2050, 1.9 billion. It's going to be the largest continent, and I want to ask you about this subsequently, where Muslim societies will coincide with Christian societies. So I think this is actually a very interesting aspect that is going to happen, that is happening as we speak. So there is more interest nowadays. I want to ask you later about the new scramble for Africa and perhaps new colonial powers that on top of England and France, we have perhaps now China or perhaps Russia. So I think this is a very interesting kind of book of many of the topical issues that the world economy and the world society kind of faces. So I just wanted to give this introduction. So I want to structure my questions into 2 parts. One that regard the book, and the second, building on the book to get your insights about Africa today and perhaps Africa in the next decades. And then after 10-15 minutes, Tiago will tell me to shut up, and we will open the floor to questions, both from the audience here and also from the people who are joining us from Zoom. And many of the people who are joining from Zoom are the students who took the African history course through the lens of economics 2 years ago, where we had more than 12,000 people joining from Africa. So, Zeinab, you start the book with Egypt. And then you go to North Africa, then you go east and slightly west and slightly south to Sudan, your native place. Why you started this way?
Well, I actually started with the origins of humankind. Egypt was the second chapter. Oh. Fair enough?
Let me say, I have a comment about that actually the very first part, which is that we are all Africans.
Yes, I mean, that's why I wanted to start that. And I took my lead on that from the General History of Africa, which did start with the origins of humankind, because, of course, if you are not African or of African descent, you are an African export. You know, nobody on Earth can not say that Africa is their mother continent. The science is settled. And I just wanted to reinforce that message to everybody to say, since you originated in Africa, aren't you interested in the continent and how it's developed, by the way? Did you know? So it was that kind of approach, and that's why I started it there. And I think people would be surprised by some of the facts, you know, between 60 to 90,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapiens began to leave the continent to populate other parts of the world, first the Arabian Peninsula, then Asia, and then Europe. And up until between 8 to 12,000 years ago, everybody was dark-skinned. Can't be sure between that 8 to 12,000 years ago till they find a skin. You know, light irises, pale complexions, flaxen hair is a relatively recent, you know, phenomenon, because obviously as people migrated, they adapted to their conditions. So that's why I wanted to start that there, because I think that if you emphasize in this increasingly polarized world our common origins, I know I'm being, you know, it's a bit idealistic here, but hey, who knows? It may just trigger in people's minds, you know, it works, you know, to try and perhaps encourage people to be a bit more cohesive. So that's why I started with that chapter. Egypt second. So what did you want to ask me about Egypt?
Okay, so why you started from North Africa and then you moved to West Africa and then to East?
Yeah. I mean, it's vaguely chronological. Of course, I started with ancient Egypt because, you know, once we became settled, or at least some of us did, and started building civilizations, ancient Egypt was a magnificent civilization. And we know a lot about it because obviously we can decipher hieroglyphics. So it made sense to start there. But I also wanted to anchor ancient Egypt very much on the continent of Africa, because you do hear debates about, you know, Egypt is somehow separate from the rest of Africa, which is something that I refute. And in fact, the general history of Africa that I cited, the most vigorous discussions and disagreements were about whether ancient Egypt was African. And I think these kind of discussions are futile. I think we have to redefine what we mean by African. There isn't a kind of, you know, identikit image of what an African is. Of course, ancient Egypt is part of Africa. It's in Africa. It always was and it will always be. So that's why I wanted to start there, because it was a great civilization and a great African civilization.
And I think that you very convincingly show that it was perhaps the first strong centralized state
yes.
with an administration, the capacity to tax. And what
Absolutely.
I particularly find very interesting is that the book actually very nicely documents academic research showing that the pyramids were built by Egyptians, not by slaves,
yes.
who viewed the pyramids as nation building.
Absolutely.
Which is something that we think today is how we can form a state, a nation, and
yeah.
we think about these grandiose projects as
yes.
doing that. So I
yeah.
found this angle very interesting.
It's a bit like the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, where, you know, Ethiopians all chipped in, didn't they? Because it was seen as a grand national project. And yes, I mean, you know, Herodotus, who you've got to take what he says with a bit of a pinch of salt, seemed to imply that the pyramids, the great pyramids at Giza, were built by slave labor. But Egyptian archaeologists and historians like Zahi Hawass refute this.
So what also fascinated me in the chapter on Egypt, and I want to connect to the first part, that we're all Africans, and the science is settled there, is that you very eloquently discuss the story of Cleopatra, who was Greek. As all Greeks tend to believe everything.
She was Macedonian origin. Macedonian, I suppose, yeah. But she spoke Greek, native language.
What I found very interesting is how the book nicely connects the journeys of humans, of Persians that occupied Egypt just before Alexander the Great arrived. Then we have the Romans. Then we have the Islam and people from the Middle East, what we'll call today the Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, coming in. So you describe very eloquently, I think, in this book, how Africa is not monolithic, but changes, and we have a lot of movements, not only out of Africa, which is the typical story of the cradle of humanity, but also people coming into Africa, moving across time and space, which I think is also a very interesting point, also if we're to think about migration today.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, you know, populations were always very fluid in Africa, the migration and the part of Africa that hits the Mediterranean coast, North Africa today, including Egypt. Of course, they were open to, you know, influences from Europe and Western Asia, just as in East Africa, the influence of, you know, Arabia from across the Red Sea was also very strong. So for sure, you see that, you know, in the melange of mix of people today in North Africa, you can see that, you know, there are people of a range of different colour complexions and so on, including in Egypt itself. But I mean, why, just to go back on this idea of Egypt and where it sits, yes, the pyramids are just outside Cairo. But the heart of ancient Egyptian civilization, Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, the Temple of Karnak, at Thebes, modern-day Luxor, and so on, very far south in Egypt, about 1,000 miles from the Mediterranean coast. This was very, very African. And I mean, and this idea, which some Egyptians today will say, no, 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 you know, we're different. You'll see that over history, the appearance of pharaohs would have been quite different. Some would have been of a fairer complexion, some would have been of a much darker complexion, different features, that kind of thing. So, you know, that's a reflection of the migration.
Yeah, and also touching upon, I think it's very nicely you put that, turning to Sudan, so going slightly south, that most Europeans, clearly myself, 20 years ago, I would have thought that Sudan, from what I read, something like a kind of annexation of, you know, the next step out of Egypt. But I think the book, I think chapter 3 or chapter 4, very eloquently kind of discusses how, in some sense, separate was the civilization, the pre-colonial civilization of Sudan, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is northern Sudan, of course. It's a huge country. Until 2011, it was the biggest country in Africa before South Sudan seceded. But northern Sudan, where my family originated, I was born there, but I've lived in England since I was 2 years of age. But northern Sudan, the kingdoms of Kush, in its earliest form at Kerma, actually predates, sorry, Elias, ancient Greece.
This cannot be true, but we can go on.
No, but it is true. It is true. Ancient Greece is what, like, I don't know, 1800 BCE, or thereabouts?
Yeah.
Well, the ancient kingdom of Kerma, and you see some of the monuments there, the Dufufas, about 3000 BCE, 2500. And, you know, it's not received the credit it deserves. A marvelous Sudanese archaeologist who now teaches at Cambridge University, Shadia Taha, very much, you know, my source for part of this chapter. You know, she says that it's quite possible that the enameling of pottery originated in the kingdom of Kush, and that's something, again, that we associate very much with ancient Greece. The dyeing of material also may have originated there. And in its heyday, the kingdom of Kush, around the 8th century BCE, before Common Era, which I focus on in my book, the kings of Kush governed Egypt for the best part of a century and were also a regional superpower. You know, they were protectors of the princes of Phoenicia and Byblos in modern-day Lebanon, in Jerusalem, and fought the Assyrians on numerous occasions, and the Assyrians were the superpower of the Middle East, so, you know, the Middle East at the time. And one of their kings, Taharko, is mentioned in the Bible. So, you know, the kingdom of Kush been eclipsed by its more glittering neighbour to the north, but really it's an amazing history, which is really, really worthy of greater study.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things of the book, and I think this you accomplish, at least in the first half for sure, is that typically you read about the Queen of Sheba, or you read about one particular episode, I don't know, in the Old Testament or in your high school textbook, but you tend to associate, as you pointed out in your introduction, oh, this is like one event, or North Africa is not exactly Africa, or this is unique. But I think the book very nicely draws the connections that this kind of a civilization, which was like very diverse, of course, like all civilizations, but which had a lot of mingling and connections.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, just going back to Cleopatra and the depiction, as you say, we all had it. I mean, you know, I was at school in London, obviously, and you know, the kind of image we have of Cleopatra, either the Shakespeare play, Antony and Cleopatra, or Elizabeth Taylor, whatever, this exotic, you know, seductress and so on. Whereas if you read about Cleopatra from Arabic sources, and I was with a marvelous woman historian in the University of Alexandria, very different picture they have of her. First of all, they say she was not conventionally beautiful by any means, you know, had a I don't want to go into what features look like, but she apparently was not by any means a conventional beauty, extremely clever, spoke 10 languages fluently, including ancient Egypt, was one of the few of the Ptolemaic dynasty who actually bothered to learn how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, surrounded herself with scholars, scientists, lawyers, you know, you name it. So they had, and very shrewd economic management. I mean, the Ptolemies were particularly vicious. I mean, they make internecine warfare seem like a picnic, that they really took it to you know, a higher level, including Cleopatra herself. But it just shows you, doesn't it, how, you know, when you invert the lens and you get a different perspective of an Egyptian historian, it's very different from the image we have of her in the West.
Indeed. So I'll make big jumps in history given the time constraints. So let me jump, I think, to chapter 6 or 7, where you discuss about the Eastern African kingdoms and then the influence from Oman, from the southern Saudi peninsula. And you write in the book that this is kind of the very early evidence we have about slavery. So why don't you elaborate? I found this also part very exciting.
So I think that a lot of people, of course, know about the transatlantic slave trade, and living in a country like the UK and also North America, you know, the North American, African Americans will talk a lot about the transatlantic slave trade. Although I have to say that only a minute number of enslaved Africans actually went to North America. The vast majority went to South America and the Caribbean. But much less is talked about the, I don't want to say the Arab slave trade, because that's what people often describe it as, because we don't say the European slave trade. We give one a geography. So I'll be consistent and say the Indian Ocean slave trade, the Red Sea slave trade, and the trans-Saharan slave trade from, you know, the southern part of the continent going up to the north, because, of course, the Arabs conquered North Africa for the most part by the 7th and the 8th century. So they would take enslaved people from other parts of the continent. So collectively, these three routes, predominantly the Indian Ocean, accounted for 14 million enslaved people, starting from about the 7th or 8th centuries and lasting until the late 19th century. Compared to the transatlantic slave trade, which started in earnest in the 16th century and finished in the early 19th century, or at least the first half of the 19th century, and accounted for about 12.5 million people. So you can see the longevity of the so-called Arab slave trade was much longer and not talked about, really, either in the Arab world nor in Africa itself. And one of the academics, one of the finest brains in Africa, who was the chairman of the GHA committee, said, you know, the Arabs are in denial, he says, about, you know, this slave trade. And so I think that's one aspect. I do go into detail about this slave trade. I also do talk about the transatlantic trade and also what's called indigenous or internal slavery. And what I refute is that you do hear a lot of apologies for the slave trade saying, oh, it just, you know, the Africans themselves were going around enslaving people left, right, and centre. We just built on it. We did the same thing. We were better at it. Critical differences between the three different slave trades. Internal, indigenous slavery, very, very different. We know that from the memoirs of Olaudah Equiano, who was enslaved in Africa and also in the transatlantic trade. Indigenous internal slavery wasn't based on racism, where they thought that the people were actually inferior. Often they were women who were used as, domestic help and became wives. And if you had a child, you'd have to include them in your family compound. But having said that, of course, indigenous slavery did facilitate the later trades. But then slavery has existed in all communities everywhere. And just to finish on this, there are critical differences, again, between the chattel slavery of the transatlantic trade and the Eastern trade. For example, one striking difference is if an Arab man had a child with an enslaved African woman, that child would be born free and indeed could rise to, a very high position, could become a prince. I mean, you see it in the Saudi royal family today, that there are princes who have had, have African blood. Whereas in the transatlantic trade, if a white man had a child with an enslaved woman, that child would be born a slave. The mother would not be freed. And in fact, there are many accounts that didn't particularly include, I think I only included one, of them actually putting their own issue to work on a plantation just as hard as anybody else, So there are critical differences.
Yeah, and another difference, because there's also a lot of research on these areas that the book covers in economics, is that the transatlantic slave trade, the Europeans primarily targeted men.
Yes.
So the gender ratios changed massively in Western Africa, while this was not the case in Eastern Africa.
The Eastern trade preferred, women fetched a much higher price. They preferred to have women because they used them as concubines, sex slaves, on the whole, whereas the men were preferred in the transatlantic trade to do that back-breaking work on the plantations. And the average age of a field slave was about, they die before they hit 30.
And let me turn now to the last part before we move to the what's happening in the continent today about colonization. So the book very eloquently actually describes the scramble for Africa in the European capitals for territory in the continent after 1850 or 1870 or so. So if you were, now that you are reflecting on what you wrote and of course your work and your research, what would you say are the imprints of colonization in the continent today? Is it the artificial borders? You said Sudan, like a country that didn't correspond to any country, any nation, any linguistic group before the advent of Europeans. Is it the borders, the artificial states? Is it the lack of investments? Was it the extortion or the forced labor that kind of followed up after the enslavement, where Europeans, initially the French and the British came and say, okay, we abolish slavery, but we allow forced labor. So what would you say are like the main imprints of colonization?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's very unfashionable now to say that colonialism, you hear people say, oh, God, no, don't go on about colonialism and its impact on Africa. You've been independent for, 60, 70 years for the most part or whatever. But I have to say that colonialism has dealt Africa a very bad hand, which is still evident today. Subsequent African rulers have made that bad hand even worse. But we cannot deny that they were dealt a bad hand, precisely as you say, the artificial borders that were created, in the 19th century at the Berlin Conference, when just willy-nilly, all this because it's your area of expertise, lines were drawn and countries were created artificially, so that national cohesion and, national identity has been a real struggle for many, many African countries. And you need national cohesion in order to build and develop. It's still, my community. It's still the mindset. That's changing, fortunately, with younger Africans. But it has been a real barrier to development. The international economic order is still loaded against Africa, for sure. It still is, for the most part, the monoculture in its economy, where they are producers of raw materials for the most part. Again, this is changing to some extent, but it's still there, and that's a legacy from colonialism. Intra-African trade, as you know, is extremely low compared to Europe and Asia. It's just a fraction because they were designed, these economies, to trade with Europe, and that is still the case. There's too little trade, so it means, money goes out. It doesn't stay on the continent. But as I said, I partially understand where people today, especially people who live on the continent of Africa, if people say, oh, the Berlin Conference, oh, for heaven's sake, that was in the 1890s. I want to know about my today and my tomorrow, and, you know, I've got this president or that president in power. And they're not doing a good job, and they're swanning around in their 4x4s and their Mercedes fleets and so on, and we're struggling to make a living. So I can see that point, but as I said, dealt a bad hand, been made worse.
So if we were to go now to the more contemporary issues, given your remark, what would you identify are the core challenges for the continent today? I presume the one that you're alluding to is governance. From what you say.
I mean, you can't do anything without good governance, can you really, in Africa? You really cannot deliver. But I think that, I do think that the needle is moving. Look, if you take the short-term view of Africa today and see what's going on, I think you would have cause to be quite pessimistic. But if you take the long view, I think you would have cause to be quite optimistic. By the long view, it possibly could even be 20 years. Because, and I say that mainly because it is a young continent, as you said, 1.4 billion. By 2050, it's going to be 2 billion or even more than 2 billion. You know, the average age in Japan is 49, in Italy it's 47, in the UK it's 41. In Africa it's 18, 19, some countries like Chad, Guinea, as young as 15. Young people are, you know, innovative, they're resourceful. They want to achieve, they want to acquire, they want to buy. And a lot of the Africans I saw from, you know, cape to cape, coast to coast, there's a real hunger in their eyes. Of course, they're very angry and they're very beaten down by, you know, circumstances often. But I think that youth delivers. I mean, people often forget, they talk about Nelson Mandela and so on and, you know, old man, but actually, it was the youth wing of the ANC that started, you know, Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo. They were the young people who said, we don't want this apartheid system anymore. It was the young people who were in the vanguard of the revolution in April 2019 in Sudan that peacefully toppled a dictator after 30 years. So I am optimistic because of the youth of the continent, which means that a quarter of the world's producers, consumers, workers, or whatever will be African. And at the turn of the century, nearly half, perhaps 40%. So I see the future as African.
Well, actually, I kind of agree on the positive agenda here and the positive future, but let me push you here, especially since if I was to think about geopolitics in a very abstract setting, we can view of Africa for European interests and American interests serving as the labor reserve, let me use this word that has been used in the past for Africa, from the early phase of colonization till the turn of the 19th century. So African labor was shipped, as you pointed out, in the Caribbean, in Salvador, in Brazil, to the southern US states to provide cheap labor for the plantations, and also to India and other parts of the world. Then the Europeans kind of discover the continent with a scramble for Africa and they partition it. So then they are hungry for wild rubber initially in Congo, for gold always, then for palm oil, for cotton in the case of Mozambique. So then it's commodities. But now, if I was to turn to today and global geopolitics, I see also a desire now from both the old imperial power and the new ones, let's say China and Russia, also kind of in need for raw materials, not necessarily for cheap labor, but either for commodity, agricultural goods, or minerals. How do you see that? And actually, I see also African leaders kind of willing to play ball, if I was to use a jargon here.
No, I mean, I agree. We saw the mineral revolution in southern Africa, and everybody went the gold rush and so on, which ended, in the exploitation of the people of that particular part of Africa. And now we're seeing, the rush for the earth minerals, because Africa holds this ace in its hand, which is all the minerals that we need for the, green revolution and renewables and electric cars and all the rest of it. Africa has got a huge reserve of all this. And yes, of course, the Russians, the Chinese, and so on, other people are interested in. But I would like to say that the Africans are more savvy, now, about being exploited. I mean, you know, and there is evidence that, you know, as I mentioned in my book, you know, countries like Namibia are saying, look, we don't want to just export our minerals in their raw form. We want to give them some added value. And if you talk to Africans on the continent, they say, yeah, the Chinese, they're here. I was in Lagos, as I said, about 10 days ago, and I was talking to somebody who heads the Chinese Institute at the University of Lagos. And I said, look, you know, where do you stand on the Chinese? And there were about 4 of them I was talking to about this. And they said, look, you know, they're not perfect, but then nor were the Europeans. And at least they do something. You know, they are building things, infrastructure, developing things, whereas nobody else is doing it because, you know, you've got to have this governance thing in place and so on and so forth. So they do, it's, you know, they do, I think they're not, you know, they're not, we mustn't infantilize the Africans. They are aware of, you know, these riches that they have, and they are aware of the pitfalls of the past. And I think that there are a lot of savvy Africans, and even at the international level, people like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's Director General of the World Trade Organization. You've got Amina Mohammed, you know, the Deputy SG at the United Nations. You've got Africans in key places, Dr. Tedros, head of the World Health Organization. And these are, you know, very savvy global citizens, and they have conversations with their leaders, and they bring in expertise and know-how that I would hope Africa won't be ripped off in the future.
And let me add that in this institution, actually in this lecture theatre, we have many Africans, leaders like my great colleagues here, Ali and Tahoun from Morocco and Egypt, and many others. And many of our students are coming from the continent, and they are among the brightest and very talented and eager to go back. And also at the Wheeler Institute, we have been sponsoring many African scholars to do research.
Absolutely.
So you also see that.
Yeah.
And in our work that Tiago mentioned that we published in Nature, we do show upward mobility in education across generations, at least in some pockets of the continent. Perhaps an issue regards the inequality there. But
yeah, I think you do see a change. And just before we go to questions, because I know we may not have time for questions, but, you know, I've never known Africans to be so angry after the COVID vaccine debacle, where, you know, marvelous scientists like Professor Christian Happy, Cameroonian-born, swapped his laboratory at Harvard University, one of the world's top scientists, and said, I'm going to Nigeria to set up this laboratory there. And, you know, and he said to me, look, this is a wake-up call. You know, the European populations, the West, triple vaccinating their people, and we're just waiting for the crumbs off the table. He said, there's no alternative to self-sufficiency for Africans. There just isn't one, he said. You know, we learnt it last time with the antiretrovirals for HIV when millions of Africans died because they couldn't get the drugs. We have to rely on ourselves. And I think that has triggered a renewed vigor and interest in Africa mobilizing its own domestic resources, you know, trying to put some real welly into the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement that was signed in 2018, that I think the sense of the direction of travel is, I hope, going in the right direction, that Africa is going to look to itself much more.
Thank you, Zeinab. So let me please open the floor now for questions. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself and please pose your question. Please, Daniel over there.
Thanks. Just checking you can hear me? Great.
Yes.
First and foremost, thanks for, I guess, coming out to London Business School. I'm Mark Toma. I'm Egyptian-Australian, and I'm an MBA 25 student here at LBS. You've obviously studied a lot of different countries and its evolution in Africa. When you think about it from a contemporary perspective, is there any particular country where you think they've got the model right that other countries can sort of emulate and follow, notwithstanding that each country and geography, etc., is unique in its own way? Is there a system or a platform that other countries can emulate? And if so, if you can elaborate on why. Is it policy? Is it reform, etc.?
Do you want to collect a couple, or you want to go one by one?
Yeah, that one. I mean, I think, as you say, there's no one kind of universal blueprint that will work for all countries in Africa. And of course, it's much harder to govern a country like Nigeria than it is a country like Cabo Verde that's got, 2 people in it, 500,000 people. Do you know what I mean? And, some countries are landlocked, some countries have got lots of water. It's difficult. But I would say those countries that have good governance, that perhaps have 2-term limits. I mean, 2-term limits aren't, we don't have 2-term limits in Germany. I mean, I don't know, Angela Merkel won, 4 times, 5 times? So it isn't necessarily per se, essential to only have 2-term limits. But I think those countries in Africa, because we do have people like Paul Biya in Cameroon who've been in power for, 40 years, that probably countries with 2-term limits like Senegal just recently, peaceful transfer of power, an election that was seen as fairly free and fair. Ghana, again. So I think these are countries, and Ghana's become a middle-income country. I think the absence of conflict is very, very important. And those countries that have not had conflict, one should really look at the reason, because you can't do anything without conflict and good governance. So I would just say, pick a country which has not had a major conflict like Ghana, Senegal, although it was fraying a bit at the edges recently. The Cape Verdes, these sorts of countries. But I think every country has to find its own way.
Please.
Is this on?
Yes.
Thanks so much for being here. My name is Gaspar Tromeff. I'm a French MBA student. My family lived in Algeria at some point, but that's a different story. If you were to look at, if you were to compare countries in Western Africa, but in all of Africa that were colonized by the French and countries that were colonized by Britain, how would you compare the challenges they face, and what is your view on the France CFA zone?
Oh, the CFA zone. I mean, I think it's become quite discredited. I don't think there are many supporters for that, and it's being dismantled. You would know that better than I would, Ilyas. It's being dismantled. I mean, in terms of the countries that were so-called francophone and anglophone, I mean, the French did run their colonies very differently from the Brits. The Brits saw their colonies much more as a community of communities, and that's an idea which has translated into multiculturalism here in the UK, where, you can do your own thing as long as you do it peacefully. The French were much more assimilationist, tried to create black French men and black French women. They mixed much more with the local communities, whereas intermarriage for the British colonial officers with the locals was not allowed, was frowned upon. And again, I think you see that in France today, how they run their country. You can't mention somebody's ethnicity. You're all supposed to be equally French, but it hasn't necessarily delivered them a better record on tackling racism in France than it has in the UK, this, sort of colour-blind, religion-blind approach. In terms of the countries, though, I mean, I would say that both countries had a very mercantilist approach to the way they ran their colonies. The French, as I said, because they had a more integrated style, you had more people more embedded perhaps in the economies of these countries. Yes. And maybe some of the deals, like in Niger with the uranium deal that was made, was very detrimental to the people.
Overall, academic research does not reveal striking differences between French and British colonies. As Zeinab pointed out, research in economics shows that the British were much more likely to outsource. Let's bring the Protestant missions to educate. Education could be delivered in the local language, while the French applied, at least in education, a much more centralized kind of approach. The gentleman over there, and then Oli, I pass to you for the questions from Zoom. Please.
Thank you. I'm originally from Ethiopia. I lived here since 1991, so I can you hear me?
Slightly louder, please.
Okay, so yeah, I lived here since 1991, so I've known Zeinab for a long time, or not face to face. So I'm so excited that I get the chance actually to be here. My question is, I haven't read the book yet. I'm sure I'm going to get one. Yeah, in Ethiopia, if you speak to two scholars, they'll give you very polarized views about their history. One thing that we don't agree on is the history of the country, actually. So I don't know how you address this kind of polarized views about even a specific fact or what actually happened. People don't seem to agree? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I go so far back that I don't touch on that. I mean, I go back to the founding of the Kingdom of Aksum, and then I look at, you know, Ezana, King Ezana, Lalibela, the rock-hewn churches, and Ahmed Grang, Ahmed the left-handed, you know, that kind of era. I don't really go beyond the 1500s. 2 chapters on Ethiopia / Eritrea. Much further back, the Sabaeans, you know, and so on. So fortunately, their disagreements tend to be more recent than the ones that the areas that I looked at. So it hasn't. But I think it's interesting, when I went to Eritrea, they do talk about Eritrean history, although, of course, at that time, it was combined Ethiopia, Eritrea, even in ancient times, you know. So yes, you're right, that nation building does mean that there are sometimes myths and legends that bolster a nation's, you know, sense of identity, and that is something which I think is, you know, happens all over the world, but it didn't interfere with the areas I was looking at.
Oli, I know that you have many questions from Zoom.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Zeinab. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions on behalf of the participants that are joining us virtually via Zoom. So the first is from Kerry Pearson, who writes, "There is often an assumption in Western historiography that Africans only perceived themselves in relation to European colonizers. How important do you think internal relations and local nationalisms were in pre-colonial Africa, and how does this materialize in African historiography?"
Internal relations, yeah. I mean, I really don't see how Africans saw themselves in terms of Europeans, really until the arrival of the Europeans in earnest in the 1400s, for the most part. You know, and I think Africans, look, I mean, Africa was a relatively peaceful continent, and I think often the absence of conflict means that there isn't as much history to talk about, because the way Africans coexisted for the most part quite well over the centuries. But I think that, you know, in my book, I did try to counter this idea of Africans versus the Europeans, and I don't get to the transatlantic slave trade till about chapter 14 out of 18 chapters.
Okay,
So I hope that answers her question.
Thanks. So the second question is from Ibrahim Yunus, who asks, "How do modern African political and social movements draw on historical events and figures from the continent's past?"
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I don't think they do a great deal, but I will cite one example of Ya Asantewaa, who was a queen of the Asante people. Sometimes people say the Ashanti. And she was the one who launched the Ya Asantewaa War in 1900 against the British. And, you know, she admonished the men who were sort of giving up in the face of the British onslaught and said, look, you know, we must fight. You must exchange your loincloths for my undergarments, she said to them. You're not really men. She managed to get an army of 20,000 people, fought the British. It lasted for quite a few months. In the end, was defeated. But Ya Asantewaa was a real heroine, and Kwame Nkrumah, when Ghana got its independence, it was the Gold Coast, became Ghana in 1957. He chose Ya Asantewaa as a national symbol, an icon. Her image was put on postage stamps. There was a Ya Asantewaa secondary school for girls set up. She became very much a kind of symbol for you know, Ghana's nationhood. So I would say that that's a very clear example of how a historic figure has been used in, you know, modern day nation building. There are other examples.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Just one more from the virtual participants, if we've got time, Elias. So this comes from Kevin Crump, who asks, ancient African artifacts and writings show up in other continents. What are the earliest examples of African culture being exported, and how have they impacted areas of the world?
Yeah, I mean, very true that, you know, there was a 2018 study published, commissioned by the French government, the Savoy SAR report, which found that more than 90% of African art and artifacts is held outside the continent, hence the push for restitution. The earliest examples, I mean, I would guess that one of the earliest examples would have been ancient Egyptian art. You know, the Romans, the Greeks and the Romans were huge admirers of ancient Egyptian culture. They recognized that this was a great civilization, and they would have taken some of their artifacts certainly away and emulated them also in their own work. I mean, the influence of Africa on ancient Greece and Rome, I think, is, you know, a huge area of study, which is undertaken by classicists, but most classicists are Europeans. But I would say that that would be the earliest example. I mean, the Romans loved going to ancient Egypt. I mean, the Emperor Hadrian used to go on cruises along the Nile. You know, it was quite the thing to do, to be a tourist on the Nile for the Romans in Egypt. Because, of course, the Romans conquered Egypt when they defeated Cleopatra the 7th in, so it would be about 30, yeah, 31 BCE. So they ran it as a province then.
Brilliant, thank you. And thanks to all of our virtual participants for their questions.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
The gentleman over there, please.
Thank you very much. So, my name is Kofi Drega. I'm solicitor and fintech startup in Ghana. I have two questions, but I'll swap one for a statement. I think there's an undercurrent of people migrating from Africa across the Sahara into other parts of the world, primarily Europe, Near East. And you're saying you have a lot of confidence in Africa and the swelling of the population. You can touch on it briefly, but do you think it's going to get worse if the population goes to 2 million? That's not a question. That's a statement, so you can please touch on it. But the question is that, are you looking to look further into the history of Africa that is not what I'll call common? So I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, between the ages of 8 and 11, my maternal grand aunt will sit me down and tell me stories of the migration from Canaan as Hebrews to the west coast of Africa. These are core history that is not recorded. And is this something that you'll be willing to delve into rather than, you know, what I'll call the normal narratives that we have? So that's the question.
I mean, I think oral tradition is, I mean, there are some African scholars who've worked on oral tradition, looking at stories or looking at, you know, stories that have been handed down through the generations. And I think I have incorporated some of that kind of perspective, certainly in the book where I could. But I agree, it's a whole area worthy of its own book, you know, oral tradition, history through oral tradition in Africa, stories like your great aunts.
Just because I have Tiago here telling me that we need to wrap up, and I have many of you wanting to ask questions, please, quick, please.
Hi, my name's Jennifer, and I listened to your podcast, which I found enthralling, by the way. And I did the study of economics through the lens of Africa a couple of years ago, which was absolutely fantastic. But my question to you is, the West have sold democracy to the African countries as a model of governance. Do you not think it might be of benefit to those African countries if they went back to the kings and monarchs of the past, like Mansa Musa, something like that?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, yes, you know, chiefs, kings, whatever you want to call them, were the normal form of government. After colonialism, only 2 countries maintained their kings, Swaziland, now called Eswatini, and Morocco. The others just all, you know, they exist in some cases, you know, the Oba of Benin, that's the king of Benin and so on, but they don't govern their territories as such, although they are still highly regarded. But I agree, the kind of Westminster-style democracy or the French presidential system shouldn't be transplanted. And I think that there is a real movement amongst the youth, but also African intellectuals, to have develop Africa's future, you know, rooted in Africanness. And that does happen. I saw 2 countries, Zambia and Ghana, where they have a house of chiefs, including some women. And these are traditional chiefs, and they are part of the government structure because they are the kind of local community leaders. So these are 2 countries which have had, you know, relatively successful, I went and saw both, successful system of democracy, co-opting their own traditional ways. And I think there are other examples, you know, Rwanda post the genocide with the Gacaca system of local justice and so on. So I think that Africa should find its own way of doing things and not jettisoning, you know, a lot of its good traditions. And I think that that's something which I'd like to see more of. I sit on the board of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies, and that's very much at the heart of what we try to do there.
Please, very quickly.
And I'll be very quick.
Thank you very much, and thank you for writing this book. My name's Saran. I run tours to countries people never think of visiting, starting with Angola. And tourism is an essential part of how countries try and tell their stories. How does Africa develop a tourism sector that gives its version of history, much like you've tried to, and move away from 18-year-olds doing charity work for 2 weeks?
Yeah. I agree. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's unfortunate that, I mean, most African countries really want to develop their tourism. It's the most beautiful continent, as the Wheelers know. You know, Mauritania, gorgeous, very little visited. Algeria, very little visited. I mean, its ruins, which are often called Roman ruins, but I prefer to call them Numidian Romano ruins because they were built by the local Numidian people. We shouldn't call them Roman ruins. And I think you're absolutely right. People should try and visit these countries. Unfortunately, because of the visa regimes in Europe are so hard for Africans wanting to visit Europe, that they feel they have to have a reciprocal, you know, basis, although it's still much easier with a British passport to visit an African country than the other way around. But, you know, you do have to get a visa. They're often quite expensive. I know from making the TV series, travel across Africa is very, very difficult and super expensive if you want a 4x4 to go off the road. And the roads are not always very good. But I think that you're absolutely right. Tourism would help encourage people to go and break down, you know, the kind of stereotypical idea. It's not a true story, but I don't know. But a woman who had to take Ethiopian Airlines asked if she had to take her own food on the plane. It's
Please.
that kind of thing.
Please.
You know.
I think I've probably learned more about the Kingdom of Kush listening to you now than visiting the National Museum in Khartoum. And it reminded me of what you're saying, that lots of people on the continent might not be able to name an African king or queen too. And I just wonder if you have any plans to disseminate your work, not just here, but in Africa more as well.
Well, I'm very glad that it's being translated into 8 languages, including Arabic, which of course is the lingua franca for North Africa and also Sudan. So I would hope that would help in other languages. The French have resisted so far. They said they'd rather have a book written from a French perspective. But I said, look, the whole point is it's from an African perspective. But My publishers at Penguin reliably tell me that they are working on that, but we've got German, Dutch, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, Italian, so you know, a good number of languages, Chinese, and Arabic, and I would hope that that will disseminate it to a wider audience.
We will have to wrap it up. I'm sorry, because I know that many of you are raising your hands. Let me just make 2 points. It is, I think, from all the events that we have hosted at the Wheeler Institute, this is the one where people want to ask the most questions, which I think is already an indication of the book's success. And my second remark is I want to retain the last question, which is relevant also to my country. What is your view about reparations of artifacts?
Case-by-case basis. But I think that it's already happening to reparations or restitution. Restitution.
Restitution.
Yeah, of
restitution.
artifacts. Yeah. No, I mean, I support restitution. As I said, I think it's a travesty that more than 90% resides outside the continent. And I have visited countless African museums, and for the most part, they are pathetic. And it's so sad how you see the replicas, Queen Idia's bust, you know, head that sits in the British Museum. And often these artifacts aren't even on display in the Western museums. They're kept in the storeroom. And, you know, it's, I think, time that large numbers, and it is happening. I mean, they have these long-term loans. We're seeing it with some of the Asante, the Asante sword and so on. And hopefully that will bring the Parthenon marvels your way. You want them back, don't you? Of course you do.
So, Zeinab, good luck with your book. Thanks big time for being with us.
Thank you.